God, I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't. I can't do this. Ow, I want out. Oh my God. I
You pull into the driveway like you've done 100 times before. It's just past 1 p.m. on a Wednesday in July. Nothing about this moment feels different from any other pickup. This is McClenny, Florida, summer of 2023. You're a mother named Brooke, and you're here for your 10-month-old daughter, Aria. You've made this drive dozens of times. You know exactly what to expect. The same driveway, the same front door, the same routine you've trusted for months. Except today, something is off before you even get out of the car. You knock. Nobody answers. You knock again, harder this time. Still nothing. You call out her name, the babysitter's name, and that's when you see her, not walking to the door to explain, running, not toward you, not toward the house, toward her own SUV, still parked exactly where it's been all morning. Windows up, engine off. Nobody has checked on that car in hours. We're going to walk through exactly what happened next, minute by minute, decision by decision. And we're going to show you the one explanation this babysitter gave investigators that would follow her into a courtroom over a year later. Because here's the thing about this case. It doesn't split people into easy categories. It doesn't give you an obvious villain to hate from the first frame. Some people who followed this story call it a horrifying accident, the kind of tragedy that could theoretically happen to any exhausted, overwhelmed caregiver. Others call it something far worse, something that deserves the full weight of the law. By the end of this video, you'll have every fact you need to decide where you land. Inside that SUV, strapped into her car seat, is Aria. Beside her sits a diaper bag, packed that same morning by loving hands. Diapers, wipes, a pacifier, medicine, just in case. All of it untouched. She never made it inside that house. Not once. Not for a single minute all day. For 5 hours on one of the hottest afternoons of that Florida summer, a 10-month-old baby sat alone in a locked, parked car, completely unattended. Firefighters would later measure the temperature inside that vehicle at well over 130 degrees. Try to sit with that number for a second. That's not a warm car, that's an oven. Now here's what makes this case genuinely difficult to process. This isn't a story about a stranger. There's no unlicensed daycare center, nobody vetted, no red flag anyone brushed aside, no background check anybody skipped. This is a woman this family had known and trusted for years. Someone who'd been at Brooke and Justice's wedding. Someone who'd sat in the front row, celebrating at Aria's baby shower. Someone who loved this baby, to by every account anyone in this family will give you. And somehow, none of that history stopped what was about to happen. Brooke doesn't wait for anyone. She drops to the pavement right there in the driveway and starts CPR, begging her daughter to breathe, refusing to accept what her eyes are telling her. Behind her, the babysitter is already on the phone with 911, her voice shaking, asking for help. Here's the detail that would define this entire case in the year that follows. When investigators eventually sit this woman down and ask her the only question that actually matters, how do you forget a baby for 5 hours, her answer isn't what anyone expects. It isn't a chaotic house full of screaming toddlers. It isn't a moment of panic or a call that pulled her attention for 30 seconds too long. It's something else, something quieter, and in its own way, more disturbing. And we're going to tell you exactly what she said, word for word, later in this video. But first, you need to understand something crucial about this family, how they built a caregiving system they trusted completely, one that had run without a single problem for months before this day. Because that's really the only way to understand how something like this could happen. Not through a single reckless stranger, but through a system built entirely on trust, a system that worked perfectly right up until the one day it didn't. To understand how a woman this trusted ended up sprinting for that car instead of the front door, you have to go back to where the trust started years before any of this began. Here's promise number 1. Delivered in full. This case has no stranger, no ignored red flag, no skipped background check. Just people who genuinely love this baby and a system that broke anyway. To really understand that, rewind 7 years. Picture Northeast Florida, a stretch of small towns called Baker County, the kind of place where families know each other by name, where news travels down Main Street long before it ever reaches the internet. That's where 2 teenagers, Justice and Brooke, fall for each other in high school. Around town, everybody knows them as a couple. It's the kind of high school romance most people assume won't survive graduation. This one does. It's not some short-lived teenage fling that fizzles out. Justice and Brooke stay together for the next 5 years. And in October 2021, they get married. Justice's parents take to Brooke almost instantly, the kind of in-laws who treat you like their own daughter from your very first introduction to the family. Not long after the wedding, Justice and Brooke decide they're ready to start a family of their own. By January 2022, they learn Brooke is pregnant. It's the first grandchild on both sides. Everyone is overjoyed, especially Justice's mother, Pamela, a registered nurse who can hardly wait to meet her first granddaughter. They do everything excited new parents do. They pick out a name. They paint a nursery. They imagine a future that, at the time, looks simple and peaceful. But the pregnancy doesn't go the way anyone plans. Brooke develops preeclampsia, a serious condition that sends a mother's blood pressure dangerously high and threatens both her life and her baby's. There isn't much warning. The due date was supposed to be October. Instead, Aria Paige arrives nearly 6 weeks early, just over 4 pounds, small enough to fit in her father's palm. She spends her first 2 weeks of life in the NICU at Wolfson Children's Hospital in Jacksonville. Her parents spend those same 2 weeks watching over an incubator instead of a crib, waiting for doctors to finally clear her to go home. When that day finally comes, Aria is, by every account, absolutely spoiled with love. Her grandmother calls her Granny's girl every time she walks into the room, and Aria just laughs. Her grandfather says the moment he gets home from work, she reaches her arms out to be picked up, then grabs his beard and pulls with everything she has. She's already pulling herself up on furniture, working on her first steps. She loves riding in the car with her mother, the two of them turning up the radio for what Brooke calls their jam sessions. Brooke takes 12 weeks of maternity leave. Justice takes leave too. They spend every single day of it with their daughter, dreading the moment they'll have to go back to work. When that moment finally arrives, the Paiges do what a lot of young families do. They lean on the people closest to them. A relative agrees to babysit at first. That works fine until the relative's own kids come home for summer break and suddenly there isn't enough room in the house for one more. That's when Brooke reaches out to a longtime family friend, a woman with a standing reputation across Baker County for how well she looks after other people's children. Her name is Rhonda Juel. She's 46 years old, married to a man named Robert, and a mother of 3 grown children of her own. Around town, people don't think of her as a business or a formal service, or even really a babysitter in the strict sense. She's just Rhonda, someone's aunt, someone's neighbor. The woman half of McClenny has trusted with their kids at one point or another. She started babysitting as a teenager, at just 17 years old. She stepped away for years to raise her own 3 children, then returned to childcare years later. She isn't a licensed daycare. She's the kind of babysitter small towns like this one still run on, paid in cash, recommended by word of mouth, watching a handful of kids at once in a house that's naturally a little loud, a little chaotic, most mornings. And Rhonda isn't some name pulled off a referral list either. She's the best friend of Monique, Aria's grandmother on her mother's side. Rhonda was at Brooke and Justice's wedding. She sat in the front row at Aria's baby shower, celebrating the arrival of the very child she'd one day be trusted to protect. So starting in May 2023, the Paige family builds a weekly rhythm around the women they trust most with their daughter. Rhonda takes Aria on Mondays and Wednesdays, 8 a.m. until 1 p.m. Pamela Justice's mother, the nurse who works from home, takes Tuesdays and Thursdays. Monique, Brooke's mother, leaves work early every single Friday to watch her granddaughter. 7 days a week, Aria is always somewhere safe, always with someone who loves her, always accounted for. Eventually, this becomes pure routine. Rhonda arrives at the Paige home each morning, buckles Aria into her SUV, and drives her a few miles to a second house, where she also watches 3 other children. And a little after 1 p.m., like clockwork, Brooke shows up to bring her daughter home. This system runs without a single problem for months. Nobody in this family, not Brooke, not Justice, not even Rhonda herself, has any reason to believe the 19th of July, 2023, will be any different from any other ordinary Wednesday. And that's really what makes this story so difficult to sit with. There's no dramatic warning sign here for anyone to have caught. Just an ordinary morning, inside a routine that had worked dozens of times before, about to go catastrophically wrong. Bridge. None of that history explains what happened next. For that, you need the timeline laid out minute by minute. Here's promise number 2, and we're delivering it in full right now. The complete minute-by-minute timeline of the 19th of July, 2023. No skip details. Let's walk through exactly what happened. 5 key moments define this case. Here they are, in order. 1. Around 8 a.m. Rhonda pulls up to the Paige home in McClenny to pick up Aria, same as she has most Mondays and Wednesdays that spring. Everything about this morning looks completely ordinary. 2. According to her own account, she makes one stop along the way, a Burger King drive-thru. The line is too long, so she keeps driving without stopping. 3. From there, she heads to a house a few miles south, where she also watches 3 other children that summer. This is the same second location that's part of the routine every week. 4. By her own account, when she pulls into that driveway, Aria appears to be asleep in the back seat, and here, Rhonda makes the decision that will define the rest of her life. 5. She leaves the baby exactly where she is. She walks inside and starts her morning with the other children, telling herself she'll come back for Aria in just a few minutes. She never does. Outside, the temperature that day is already climbing past 96 degrees. The SUV sits out in the open driveway, no garage, no shade, nobody checking on it. And inside the house, the morning goes on exactly like any other. Kids get fed, diapers get changed, small arguments over, toys get broken up and forgotten. Nobody asks where Aria is, because as far as anyone in that house knows, she's exactly where she's supposed to be. Asleep, safe, just a few feet away, in a routine that's played out the exact same way dozens of times before. Sit with that for a second. This wasn't a house full of people ignoring a crying baby. It was a house where nobody had any reason to think a baby needed checking on at all. Knowing that, do you think she appeared asleep is a believable explanation for what happened next, or does something about it not add up for you? Nobody checks on her again for 5 hours. When Brooke arrives a little after 1 p.m. and Rhonda runs for that SUV, what she pulls out of the back seat is a baby with blue and purple lips, not breathing. Rhonda carries her toward the garage and calls 911. Brooke drops to the ground beside her daughter and begins CPR, following the dispatcher's instructions on the phone, refusing to stop no matter what. Paramedics arrive and take over. They rush Aria to the hospital, still performing CPR the entire way. Aria's grandmother arrives soon after. She'll later describe watching rescue workers pull her granddaughter from the ambulance, still working on her, and somehow knowing, just from the look on one paramedic's face, that this wasn't going to end well. It doesn't. A doctor eventually comes out to speak with the family and delivers the news no parent is ever prepared to hear. The Baker County Sheriff's Office later released a public statement calling it one of the hardest cases the department has ever had to handle. They said they chose to keep the investigation quiet at first, purely out of respect for a grieving family and a community in shock, only releasing details once Florida's public records law required them to respond to media requests. Here's the detail that follows this case all the way into a courtroom, more than a year later. When investigators finally sit Rhonda down and ask her the question everyone following this case once answered, "How do you forget a baby for 5 hours?" her response isn't a chaotic house full of screaming kids. It isn't a moment of panic she can barely describe. She tells them her mind had simply drifted, caught up in thoughts about an unrelated family matter entirely disconnected from the children in her care. That's it. That's the full explanation for 5 hours of silence, 5 hours in which nobody checked on a sleeping baby locked in a car in 96-degree heat. Think about what that explanation is actually asking you to accept. Not a crisis, not an emergency that pulled her attention away for a moment, just drift. A wandering mind for 5 straight hours while a baby sat outside in the heat. You now have the complete timeline of July 19th. Start to finish. But an explanation like that raises a much harder question than any of the facts alone. Was this a tragic human lapse in attention? Or was it something the law needed to define as far worse? That question is exactly what turns this from a tragedy into a legal battle, one that would take a jury the better part of a year to resolve. What do you think was actually happening in Rhonda's mind that morning? Genuine panic she couldn't process, total denial, or something colder than either of those? 5 hours of silence needed an explanation the law could actually work with. What she gave investigators split the room right down the middle. Rhonda's explanation doesn't sit well with a lot of people who hear it, and it clearly doesn't sit well with investigators either. The very next day, Thursday, July 20th, Rhonda Juel is arrested. Word moves through Baker County the way it always does in a small town, faster than any headline could travel. This is a woman half the county once trusted with their own children at one point or another over the years. Now she's sitting in handcuffs, facing serious charges connected to the death of a 10-month-old girl her own community had watched grow up. The case moves through Florida's court system over the following year, and it forces a jury to wrestle with a genuinely difficult question. Prosecutors argue this wasn't a brief moment of panic or distraction. It was 5 uninterrupted hours of inattention from a woman responsible for keeping a child alive. The defense frames it in an entirely different light, as a tragic, unforeseeable lapse, not an act driven by malice or intent to harm. Somewhere between those two arguments, a jury has to decide which version of events they actually believe. After weighing the evidence, the verdict comes back. Rhonda Juel is convicted of third-degree murder and child neglect. She's sentenced to 17 years in prison. Here's the detail that unsettles a lot of people who follow this case closely, once they sit with it. There's no evidence anywhere in this case that Rhonda intended harm. Nobody involved, not prosecutors, not the family, not the court, suggests she wanted Aria to suffer. And yet the legal system still arrived at the word murder. That gap, the distance between what someone intended and what the law ultimately calls it, is exactly what makes this case so difficult to file away neatly in your mind. This isn't a story with an obvious monster at the center of it. It's a story about how catastrophic ordinary human distraction can become when the stakes involve a child who can't speak up for herself. Do you think the charge matched what actually happened here, or was it either too harsh or not harsh enough, given everything you now know? For Aria's family, the verdict doesn't undo anything that happened that July afternoon. It doesn't bring back a single one of the moments they lost with her. It just marks the beginning of trying to live with a loss nobody in that family saw coming, a loss caused by someone they never stopped trusting, right up until the moment trust stopped being enough. You'd think a 17-year sentence would be the natural end of a story like this one. A verdict, a punishment, a case finally closed. It isn't. There's a part of this case that most people who followed the initial headlines never actually heard about, something that happened well after the sentencing. something that reopens the entire question this case seemed to have already answered. 17 years was supposed to be the end of this story. It wasn't, not even close. Here's what almost nobody following this case from the outside expects to learn. Rhonda Juel is no longer behind bars right now. She's currently out on bond, pending an appeal. And the legal argument behind that appeal is genuinely worth slowing down to understand because it changes how you might think about this entire case. Her attorneys argue that the felony murder charge never actually required prosecutors to prove she intended to harm Aria at all, that the law allowed a conviction for murder without that step ever needing to happen. That single legal question is now what her entire appeal hinges on. To be completely clear about what this does and doesn't mean, this isn't an exoneration. It doesn't mean the conviction has been overturned, and it doesn't mean any court has decided Rhonda didn't do what she was convicted of doing. What it means is that the legal system hasn't actually finished deciding this case, not the facts of what happened on July 19th, but the deeper legal question of how those facts should be judged under Florida law. For Aria's family, that means there's no clean sense of closure here. No final chapter they can point to and say, this is over now. Just a continued wait for a decision that could still go in either direction, more than 2 years after they lost her. Something did come out of this tragedy, though something that exists because of Aria specifically, and will likely outlast every headline this case ever generated. Florida lawmakers passed what's now known as Aria's Act, legislation that officially designates April as Hot Car Death Prevention Month across the entire state. It won't undo a single hour of what happened in that driveway. It won't give Brooke and Justice back a single day with their daughter. But it does mean Aria's name is now permanently attached to something built specifically to stop this exact scenario from happening again, to another family, in another driveway, on another ordinary Wednesday. 10 months old. A caregiving system built entirely on years of earned trust. 5 hours where nobody checked. This case refuses to hand you a clean villain or a tidy explanation you can file away and forget. What it gives you instead is a woman this family genuinely loved and trusted for years, a mistake or a crime, depending on how you weigh it, that cost a baby her life, and a legal fight that, as of right now, still isn't finished. We'll be following this appeal closely as it develops. When there's a ruling, we'll bring you that update the moment it happens, not weeks later, not buried in some roundup video, but as its own dedicated follow-up. If cases like this one matter to you, if what you actually want is the real, fully verified story instead of a sensationalized version built for shock value, subscribe now so you don't miss that follow-up when it lands. So, we'll leave you exactly where this entire case leaves everyone who takes the time to sit with it. Was this a tragic accident that spiraled beyond anyone's ability to stop it, or was it negligence serious enough to genuinely deserve the word murder? Tell us honestly where you land in the comments below and why. Either answer you land on doesn't change the one fact at the center of all of it. A 10-month-old girl is gone. And more than 2 years later, a legal system is still working out exactly what that should mean.